Hi, everybody, and welcome to the January 25th, 2024 edition of the KubeStellar Community Meeting. Let's see, this will be our first meeting of the new year. So I'm just bringing up now is my browser. Here we go. Okay, cool. All right. Let me shut off my other distractions. Okay. So the KubeStellar meeting, we abide by a contributor code of conduct. I'll read that really quickly. If you're not already signed up to see the agenda, you can go to kubestellar.io/join us, which is located right here on my screen. That'll give you access to this document, to be able to read and write from it, add your name to the agenda. This is a recorded call and it will be posted on YouTube and our channel. You're welcome to stay on the call and participate video and audio, but if you choose not to, that's fine too. Please log off or mute yourself or shut off your camera. The contributor code of conduct that we follow as contributors and maintainers in the CNCF community and in the interest of fostering an open and welcoming committee, we pledge to respect all people who contribute through reporting issues, posting feature requests, updating documentation, submitting pull requests, or patches, and other activities. We are committed to making participation in the CNCF community a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of level of experience, gender identity, and expression, sexual orientation, disability, personal appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, age, religion, or nationality. It basically means, hey, we're all human. Just be nice to each other, please. Thank you. All right, I see some people typing in their names. It's good. All right, great. So please add your name to the attendees list if you'd like to. All right, so we've got a couple of big announcements that have happened over the past few days, so past couple weeks, I should say. Back on December 19th, we were granted CNCF Sandbox project status. It's a fantastic accomplishment for the team and and for all the contributors in the community assembled here. I'd like to thank everybody for all their support and everything they've done to make us KubeStellar the success that it is today. Thank you all. Secondly, we've made some updates to our architecture to simplify the mechanics of it, I guess you could say, and also to make it a bit more flexible. So we've started with reducing the number of instructions that are required to install and operate KubeStellar, which is a fantastic move in the right direction. We've also removed a lot of the moving parts behind KubeStellar, which makes it a little less complex to maintain, and also allows more places for people to contribute in native ways, like APIs, rather than necessarily having to write code in Go. So I think all those things are positive. We're also working towards something called a pluggable transport, which will allow us to swap in and out the transport mechanisms. In the past, we were reliant on our own synchronization technology, which was basically an adaptation from what we had learned from KCP. And now we've broadened our horizons and we're using OCM's clusterlet and some of OCM's technology at the heart of the architecture. In the future, we'll be able to swap these parts out and use other transport mechanisms from other providers and projects around the open source community in an effort to be as open, flexible, and collaborative as possible. So I think I recapped that enough there, but we'll get on to the particulars. So, and first and foremost, we have changes to the KubeStellar architecture. So Paolo, why don't you walk us through the updates that have been made over the past few weeks and how we're using KubeFlex and our first ever swappable transport mechanism, OCM.
Sounds good. Thank you, Andy, for the introduction. So we start reviewing the high-level architecture for KubeStellar, where we are, based also on pretty much the model that we've been advocating for a while. And so the idea is that we have this concept of spaces. We've been talking about this for a while. A space essentially representing some way is an abstraction that somehow represents Kubernetes API server API, and somehow also the associated controllers, because that gives some kind of behavior to the space itself. And the user typically will interact with KubeStellar, somehow will interact with KubeStellar through spaces. So for example, we have this concept of workload definition space where the user can submit, for example, placement policies and workloads. And the placement policy essentially defines the what, defines which part of the workload, the whole workload that goes, where it goes, right? It defines where it goes in terms of the execution cluster, the workload execution cluster that we see on the right. For example, I have a deployment. I want this deployment to be deployed on maybe 2 of these 3 clusters I see on the right. I can define a placement to basically deliver the deployment over there. And there is also another space is represented here on the bottom that we sort of consolidated. You could have also a separate space for just the inventory, representing pretty much the inventory of the clusters. But for simplicity, we sort of consolidated, at least in this picture, we are viewing one. So we have an inventory and also what we call a transport space. As Andy alluded before, we are moving to a pluggable architecture for the transport. So we can use the original sinker that we've been using for a while, or we can use also other projects. For example, right now, the first architecture we are focusing on the first actually pluggable transport we are focusing on now, we are relying on the open cluster management transport and agent. And of course, we're also looking at others. And also we're looking at standardizing some of these interfaces. For example, for clusters, we are considering one of the most promising is the SIG multi-cluster inventory API. There is some momentum around that API. Some other projects are also looking and some are looking at adopting that API. And then, of course, also between the workload definition space and the inventory and transport space, especially the transport space, another API that is being standardized by the SIG multi-cluster is the work API. That's another one that also been considering here. Let's move on. I just want to say a few more words on the KubeStellar spaces. Andy already alluded that we've been sort of simplifying our stack and simplifying. So we decided to sort of converge what was initially just a provider of spaces, KubeFlex, and the space manager, because the functionality in a way can be seen as very related. So just pretty much merging these 2 components together. Now we have this new space manager. This essentially is the KubeFlex project we've been working on for a while. As I said, the space is essentially representing a Kubernetes API server related controllers, and KubeFlex is now the space manager for KubeStellar. And right now we have a different type of spaces that can be supported by KubeFlex, and we can add more because it's actually very flexible and extensible. The main spaces that we are using is the K8s space. So this represents, essentially it's vanilla upstream Kubernetes API server, plus a subset of controller manager controllers for some of the basic features that are still required in a Kube API server, for example, a namespace controller or garbage collection controller, or other things that you need to have some basic functionality there. But the workload, many of the controllers are related to workload, like deployment controller, pod controller, nodes controller, those are disabled. So this allows us to achieve the kind of denaturing behavior that we need so that you can apply some particular workload resource on this space, and then that doesn't trigger the creation of pods somehow specifically on that space, but we can actually have other controllers like the KubeStellar controllers that are picking up those workload objects and wrapping them and transferring them to our delivery mechanism to the target cluster. That's exactly the behavior that we wanted to have to provide this kind of Kube native API upfront. We do support also other type of spaces, for example, vCluster. There is a lot of traction right now in community for vCluster, and there are use cases where running some pods in that particular space makes sense. For example, one use case we have is for, especially for kind of dev environment where you are kind of limited in resources, so you don't really have a big requirements. You can run, for example, an instance of open cluster management there. We actually automate the installation to make it really easy for users to use it without having to explicitly go and install yourself in some other cluster and so on. We have also other types. For example, host is relatively new, and the idea is you can also use your hosting cluster where you're running KubeFlex and KubeStellar to basically as a space. So you may have some use case where actually this may be useful. And then there's also the case of where you just have other clusters outside. You want just to import them as external clusters. For example, you may use an external cluster as a workload definition space. Maybe you don't want to install anything on that cluster. Maybe you're running something like Kubeflow on the cluster. You don't want to install KubeFlex or KubeStellar there. You can just import the cluster and use that as a WDS. Same thing you can do also if you want to use that as a, for example, if you want to use that for transport, like you have an OCM cluster running somewhere else, you want to use that. And we have also other example. There is also this multi-cluster control plane that is like a light OCM instance and so on. So in the future, probably based also on use case, on requirements or interest from community, we may consider actually extending, adding more types. Let's move on to the actual architecture for 020. So after seeing the sort of abstract architecture, I wanted just to give some more concrete view of how the architecture looks like in the upcoming release of 020. Where we're moving to 020, because again, as Andy said, this is sort of updated architecture. The API, the user experience in a sense is pretty much the same, doesn't really change that much. The whole idea that you can pretty much apply a placement, you can apply workloads on the WDS and then deliver them, that doesn't really change. But what changes is really to simplify the way you pretty much you set up, install and operate the system. And so after you pretty much install the KubeFlex, that is pretty much one step. You just have one installer, or can you just also use Helm chart to install? It's up to you. You can use the KFlex CLI, you can use the Helm chart to install in a hosting cluster. It can be kind cluster, for example, or Kubernetes cluster, can be OpenShift cluster. We support that. Once you have that, pretty much you have your running hosting cluster with KubeFlex, the controller manager that is basically give you the ability now as a space manager to create spaces. And now you can do things like create. You see the first step is to create a space of type inventory and mailbox. So we're using the term inventory and mailbox or inventory and transport. We're probably going to move to transport in the future. And that essentially provision a vCluster that you see in the picture on the right, a vCluster type space. And also we have this concept of plugins of post-create hooks that allow you to run arbitrary controllers or installation steps automatically after a space is created. In this particular case, we have a plugin called OCM. Essentially what it does, it triggers a job that will use the CLI for OCM, the cluster ADM CLI. It will install OCM on that particular space. And OCM has a concept of namespaces that are used to essentially as a mailbox to deliver content to clusters that need to be wrapped. This workload needs to be wrapped into so-called manifest work. And then there is also a concept of managed cluster that is the inventory somehow representing the clusters. Once you have that, then the next step is simply to run another one-line command that will create a WDS space. And this, what it's going to do also, we have to update, by the way, this chart because it's actually now called KubeStellar. It's going to install a control. It's going to create a space of type K8S that is a vanilla Kubernetes API server, as I mentioned before, and also is going to run, install and run a controller pointing to that particular space. And that's really the KubeStellar controller. There are a couple of more steps that are really about somehow registering the cluster, the workload execution cluster. You need to create them and to register them now with the OCM. And then after that, you are ready to go, right? You can start doing things like applying a placement policy. You can submit a workload, and pretty much everything works as before, right? So now you have this flexibility to, with one command, to create, if I need, for example, another workload definition space, I can do that. I can create another one, for example, for another set of users. Then I can just apply placement and workloads there. So in terms of this architecture, just a few highlights how pretty much this works. The idea is that once a user submit a workload and a placement, the KubeStellar controller manager is actually watching those resources, watching all the workload, all the type of resources, the resources that eventually you want to deliver. He has actually informers there that have started, dynamic informers looking at those resources. And also looking at the placement. So whenever there is a new object, essentially the controller manager will look at the placement and will figure out which placement are matching a particular object. And then based on that, is going to find where this need to be delivered. And then he's going to wrap that into manifest work. He's going to deliver to the namespace. And from there, the transport will take care of deliver to the final cluster. And that's pretty much the high-level inner working of this. So we simplified a lot the stack. We actually have now much leaner controller. We're also considering for the future situation where you may not want to necessarily to be tied to just have to have something like KubeFlex underneath. You say, well, maybe I just want to run this on a cluster. Maybe I just have some CRD, some CR. Actually, I want to deliver to my target cluster. Then I can somehow simplify a little bit more. And then I can actually run just the controller. So that's something also we're considering for the future, but the initial 0-20 architecture is pretty much based on having KubeFlex as the base, really at the space manager. On top of that, we can lay now the spaces, we can lay the controller, all of that to somehow make this actually to work. I just wanted to quickly go over one important use case for us and to show us how this will work, this architecture will work in that use case. This is about data preprocessing for multi-cluster. And the idea is that there is, for example, a hosting cluster where we also have KubeStellar with a space manager. And normally the idea is you can use something like, for example, Open Data Hub and Kubeflow to basically run jobs on that hosting cluster. But now we have a scenario where the data scientists want to use more power, want to use actually cluster with the GPUs that are actually distributed around the cloud or clouds because maybe it doesn't have enough GPUs in his own cluster and so on. And so the idea is to dispatch also jobs to other clusters. And this can be done. How KubeStellar can help is pretty much to provide these two spaces that I show pretty much earlier on, the WDS where actually you can deliver a workload. And there are two types of workloads here. One is this pretty much definition of the job that contains pretty much is wrapped into something called app wrapper. We're also using another open source project called the Multi-Cloud Application Dispatcher, the MCAD, that does things like figuring out which one is the best cluster to run and doing things like gang scheduling on the hosting clusters, on the actual clusters where you run and so on. So the idea is that this actually can leverage KubeStellar to do the distribution, right? You can actually have these wrapped jobs in the app wrapper. We can use this workload definition space that is pretty much the hosting cluster. There is a type host there. So you don't have to sort of redeliver this to a space with some other controller. And then there is also the other scenario where you have, for example, an admin that wants to install the stack for those clusters. And so this one actually of the scenarios that maybe with some difference people can also try soon because you have the support now for this WDS of type host and K8S. So that is pretty much all I wanted to say. I don't know if there is any question, any comments. Otherwise, we'll move to the next topic.
All right. I don't hear any other questions. Just a second. Yeah. So, okay. So thank you very much, Paolo, for the overview and reviewing the architecture in deep detail as well. Yeah, you can see, I think you can see a lot of utility here for KubeStellar's future, right? The idea behind what you showed in the data preprocessing realm is, the bits about configuration and how to get jobs to run specifically for data preprocessing across multiple clusters, across multiple clouds. Another aspect of KubeStellar, things that we've been doing are things, having to do about deployment of full stacks. Of course, you mentioned things like ODH, KFP, CodeFlare's SDK, MCAD itself, MCAD's agent. So, there's the idea about, how can KubeStellar be used to deploy an entire platform, right? How could KubeStellar be used to secure an entire platform in the case, or provision an entire platform? ZTP comes to mind. There's also the ideas about developer productivity, right? So how could KubeStellar, specifically the vCluster integration, be used to help with developer productivity? You don't have to give everybody a designated cluster that they have to own, maintain, and feed, right? You can just use vCluster and they can deploy their CRs there. So yeah, there's a lot of things, a lot of utility behind KubeStellar that's lurking in the wings that I hope that we can unlock the potential for in the year ahead. That's pretty cool. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
All right, let me go back to sharing the agenda. Okay, so the next up is, well, now that you've heard about how KubeStellar is changing architecturally, the experience stays the same as we've had in 0.14. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on in the plans to get that to release. So I think, Ezra, you've been running lead on that. Can you give us some updates?
Let me just share. Thank you, Andy. So I link in the agenda, we are actually tracking everything through GitHub, so you can all see everything. Can you see my screen? I had
Yes.
my problems before. Excellent. So this is issue 1622. We basically defined few phases that will help us reach the stable next release, which is KubeStellar 0.20. To remind you, we officially released 0.14 and 0.15. So this is 0.20 with all the good stuff that Paolo just described before. We are tracking everything with labels. So you can see we have phase 0, which will be ended, which is in sprint 8, should be done by the end of this month. This is basically allowing all developers to start understanding the new, as Andy mentioned, our new engine for KubeStellar, how to develop with that and so on, because basically the mission and interactions are the same, but the development process is a little bit different because we actually change a lot of the code. So this is basically done. We are now in the middle. We defined an intermediate milestone, which we call snapshot 1, KubeStellar 0.20 snapshot 1. We call it phase 1. This should be done in sprint 9, ended at end of February. And basically the incentive behind that is to be able to get a stable kind of snapshot of KubeStellar with all the 0.20 with the exact same 0.20 API and user experience. So we do not plan to have another round of changes and so on. The main difference between this snapshot and the release that you can see, the next phase is the release, which will come on sprint 10, is basically fixing issues, bugs, optimization, and especially a lot of improvement in the documentation. The documentation for The snapshot will help you deploy, run, develop in the snapshot, but probably for the release, we need something better. But again, I think the main point, you can see the criteria. The main point is that we do not, it's not an official release candidate in a sense that we are going to change maybe documents and maybe small new features will be added. But the main goal here is to not make any major changes between the snapshot and the release, especially not in the API in the UX. So you can see all the, if you go to just to our issues, you can easily just, type here, search for the project KubeStellar here, and then you can just pick, for example, our phase one, and you should be able to see all the items that are for phase one, quite a lot, as you can see. And you can also track that with our project in KubeStellar, and we have our board where you can actually see all the items in phase one, phase 0, and in the release. So this is basically it. Just to summarize, let me stop share. To summarize, we plan to finish the official phase 0 at the end of this month, and then in a month period, in a sprint period, we will release the kind of official snapshot, testing snapshot of the 0.20, and then a month later, the 0.20. Feel free, of course, to push issues, assign yourself to PRs, to issues as a usual thing. Just keep in mind, we will need to see whether it fits into 0.20 or should be done in a later phase. That's basically it. Any question on the plan? Yeah, and I just want to mention that currently we do not, of course, there is a lot of work, but we do not see any major showstopper or something that will make us not meet the deadline of supplying a stable next release. So those are good news. So thank you, Andy. That's all the update I have.
Hey, thanks a lot, Ezra. Thanks for stepping up and pitching in here. Appreciate it. Okay, let's next up on the agenda is the update on KubeCon EU. Unfortunately, we did not get accepted for our session on the multi-cloud computer and that specific RFP. Paolo and I were going to present. There was a lot of competition. It seems to be more feverish every year. But there's another opportunity for us to talk about it in GitOpsCon. So I'm going to be putting together an RFP for that. That'll be out in Seattle sometime, I think, beginning of the second quarter. And then, but there is some really good news. I've saved it for last here, so to speak. At KubeCon EU in Paris, our two of our community members put together a poster session on software-defined agriculture and or digital agriculture, as they call it, DA now. Braulio and Glar, congratulations. There is a scheduled poster session that will be held in the pavilion on Wednesday at 6 p.m. That's Central Eastern Time, CET, in Paris. So I urge you all, as I know you all travel to Paris at that time of year, to stop in and say hello to Braulio and Glar. So fantastic work. Congratulations, Braulio. Would you like to say anything about that?
Yes, thank you, Andy, for the kind introduction. So just to add to what Andy is saying, so yeah, in this work, we are going to show a framework that we developed that is going to allow agriculture decision maker to make a sustainable crop management decision in a digital agriculture. And this framework, yeah, is powered by the KubeStellar tool. So we're looking forward to see you there.
Congratulations once again. Thank you. Anybody
Thank
with any questions for Braulio? All right, I'll update you on GitOpsCon in the next meeting. Deadline for this RFP is February 4th, I believe. All right, update on the CNCF Sandbox voting. Well, I let the cat out of the bag earlier in the call. We were granted Sandbox status. Fantastic. There was only a few projects given project status over the course of 2023. There's fewer than there were in 2022. So it looks to me that there's some level of exclusivity, which was nice. I'd like to be in incubation at some point in the future. That's pretty cool, provided we can get some customers and clients and consultants interested in our project. Really would love some help. I'm calling anyone out there in the community that can help us get introductions to folks that could use a project like ours, as flexible and as collaborative as we've become over the year. I'd appreciate anything you can do to help us make some inroads there. So thank you. All the onboarding tests have been completed. You can see the onboarding tests as they've been completed in my comments to the same effect that issues in the CNCF Sandbox number 32. The folks there have been very helpful, and so I'm looking forward to a bright future with them. Okay, next up we have Pluggable Transport. I don't see near available. I can simply recap unless somebody else would like to do it instead of me. Anybody with a show of hands would like to recap the Pluggable Transport work? Okay. There was a question in the Slack channel, KubeStellar-dev under the Kubernetes organization in Slack, and it was to mention whether we should create a separate repository or maintain this as a submodule in KubeStellar main repository under the KubeStellar organization. The team overwhelmingly, or the collaborators and the contributors in that Slack channel overwhelmingly voted to give this specific plugin its own repository. And with that comes some errata like ownership and, of course, making sure DCO and owners are cared for, as well as security response for vulnerabilities, etc. We take our project, both the organization and the repository in the open source, very seriously. And so it was not a small matter to make this decision to add another repo to our organization. So hopefully with some best practices in place and some active governance, we can continue to make good decisions, secure decisions over the course of the community's duration. So what we did is we plan to make a repository, which right now has been created in a private format. It has not been made public yet. It is called OCM_transport_plugin. It is intended to house all the parts and mechanics that are able to create other transports, to swap out transport mechanisms underneath the KubeStellar architecture. And we're looking for other candidates. We have one of our own in the KubeStellar Syncer, and we're looking for other candidates in the future to possibly take their place as a transport mechanism fueling or supporting KubeStellar. I see Paolo has his hand raised. Paolo?
Just to add, we had also another voting between the community members for adding also another repo for the status add-on for OCM, because that's another separate piece for now. In the future, we may decide to consolidate with the transport, but for now, it's still a separate piece. So for 020, it's going to be a separate repo that we also have to put out there, and we already have agreement from our members.
Yeah, I didn't see that in the Slack channel. Did you post it there?
No, I'm gonna post it there too. But we had at least internally we discussed that.
Oh yeah, well yeah, I think it would be good for the community to weigh in on that, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's part of our governance. Okay, thanks. All right, anything else for Pluggable Transport? Okay. All right. Ezra, we have the balance of time remaining. If you'd like to take us through anything having to do with the phase 0 and phase 1 activities, you're welcome to, or we can close the call.
I will not go through the items, but I can maybe let me just share again where we stand. Right, this is it. So basically, as I said, we have, if you look, we have the main items for phase 0 are mainly documents and so on to make sure people can onboard and start developing. Most of them are done, with very few. In phase 1, I just encourage people to go through that, assign themselves to items. One major item that is not pure technical, but is related to what Paolo mentioned, is the update of all the KubeStellar IO documents. We have an excellent site that currently divided into kind of 2 areas. One is the overall description of what is KubeStellar, how do you contribute in general, the community, the mission, all of that hasn't been changed, and we are leaving that as is. However, there are there is quite a big area that go into the low-level details of the implementation. What are the controllers? How do you compile them? All of that, and this is going to be changed. There is a lot of work there. Not all of that will be here in phase 2, but certainly everything must be completed for the 0.20 release. So I urge all of you, once we put up the initial document, please go ahead, play with that, see if you can, if you find issues, just open an issue or even go through a PR. So this is, I don't think that I have something else. I just want to mention, as you, Andy, mentioned, and also Paolo, that the main is basically we have everything already working. And there are, of course, glitches and fixes and improvements. The main thing that is still to be coming is the pluggable transport. That's the main piece that is waiting to be done, hopefully during the coming couple of weeks. But other than that, all the items you can see are just some of them complex, but are kind of small features and issues. That's the only details I wanted to add on that. And the main thing is feel free to just go through them, add, remove, and so on. And that's it, basically.
Okay. Thanks, Ezra. Okay, so 2 topics before we wrap up here. Well, you can open the floor for other people also to give their input if you have anything you'd like to talk about. 2 things I wanted to bring up. One, it was a direct question for you, Ezra. Will you be, are you on the lookout for a Kube Day in Israel? That one snuck up on us last year.
We can certainly do that. I wasn't following the Kube Day in Israel.
I don't know that there is one this year. I noticed there is no KubeCon in China this year. There is,
so I will look.
and I don't know if there's Kube Days, but sometimes they sneak up, so you might want to take a look.
I will certainly have a look. Thank you, Andy. It's a good point. Yes.
Okay. Second thing is, I was just mentioning to Paolo about using the Slack channel. There's not a lot of activity in the KubeStellar-dev channel recently since the new year, and it's been sparse all along for the most part. But it'd be really cool if we could move a lot of our communications out there to see to show people, the vibrance and the activity, and then other people can get involved. So yeah, so I was wondering if I could challenge the community here to do more in the KubeStellar-dev. Does anybody want to support that notion or reject it?
It's reasonable to me.
Mike, you there?
Yeah, I was just saying, seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I support it. I support as well. We on our next IBM team meeting, we can discuss how and exactly what topics. I think that a lot of our internal team discussions can be moved to the external one. It makes sense. We're discussing open source items, right? So yeah, absolutely, Andy, that's a good idea.
Great. Okay. Thank you for your support on that. Anybody else have anything else they'd like to add in the call? Kevin, anything new on, I have a question. Anything new on ESA, European Space Agency?
Not at the moment. They were going crazy at the end of the year. And so the experiments I'm doing, trying to get this to work on Pi, I kind of want to have something to go back to them with, where I've shown that something is working. It's working the way we talked about it. And I haven't heard from Jonas yet this year. We certainly weren't being cut out. He definitely wants me to stay involved. And so we'll see what happens.
All right, good. This is on the call. Is there anybody out there, James Sutton, Graham White, anybody who would like to participate? Or did I go too far and call you out inadvertently? Sorry.
You're all good, Andy. So James and I, it's our first time joining the call. We work together in the IBM Research Technical Experiences team. We're familiar with Andy, but probably new to everybody else on the call, I would imagine. So my team's responsibility is to take new technologies to conferences like Think or into the GTO and basically build user experiences around them. So we're sort of lurching at the moment, or lurking, shall I say, at the moment in the community, but are very much sort of actively looking at building some kind of multi-cloud technology stack based on KubeStellar.
I'm glad that you're lurking more than you're lurching.
Yes, wrong word, sorry.
All right, great. Okay. All right, folks, that's all I have. If anybody else does anybody else have anything going once? Twice? All right, fantastic. See you all again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.